The wind had been rising since dusk, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the promise of a long night. Out on the open prairie, storms didn't creep in, they came roaring like an army, drumming against the tin roofs and making the windows tremble. Daniel Carver sat at his worn wooden table, polishing the barrel of his rifle by the lamplight. The only sound in the room was the steady tick of the clock on the mantel and the occasional snap of the fire in the hearth. Solitude had been his constant companion for years now. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just wasn't used to them anymore. The ranch didn't need much company, and neither, he'd told himself, did he. But nights like this had a way of gnawing at him, reminding him how big and empty the world could feel when there was no one to share it with. A sudden knock shattered the quiet. Not a timid tap, but a desperate pounding, urgent enough to startle him upright. Daniel set the rifle aside and moved to the door, boots thudding on the floorboards. When he pulled it open, the storm reached in like a wild thing, cold wind and rain slapping against him. In the wash of lightning, he saw her. She stood framed in the doorway, drenched from head to toe, her bonnet sagging under the weight of rainwater, tendrils of wet hair plastered to her cheeks. Her dress clung to her as if it had no more will to keep her warm. But what caught him most were her eyes, wide, frightened, but holding a flicker of dignity, like a candle fighting the wind. Please, her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. I have nowhere else to go. Daniel's gaze swept over her, soaked gloves, mud-stained hem, the small satchel clutched in her hands as if it were the last thing she owned. She swallowed hard before speaking again. They told me this was the closest ranch. I was supposed to meet my husband in Clearwater, but, her words broke, catching in her throat. She tried again, her breath shivering in the cold. But he's gone. I can't stay there. I don't know where else to, she trailed off, blinking back the tears threatening to fall. Daniel hesitated for only a moment. He wasn't accustomed to unexpected visitors, especially not women in the dead of night, looking like they'd walked through half the county to get there. His life had been built on caution and measured decisions. But there was something about the way she stood there, shivering but unbroken, that pulled him past all hesitation. Come in, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He stepped aside, and she crossed the threshold. The scent of rain and wildflowers followed her in, the storm closing behind them as he shut the door. She stood awkwardly, dripping on the floor, clutching her satchel. Daniel reached for the fire, throwing another log on to push back the chill. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but in here, the warmth began to spread, slowly, cautiously. Between two strangers who had no idea how much their lives were about to change. The warmth of the fire began to seep into the room, chasing away the sharp bite of the storm. Daniel grabbed an old quilt from the back of the rocking chair and held it out to her. Here, he said, avoiding her gaze. Best get warm before you catch your death. She hesitated, glancing between the quilt and him, as if measuring the risk of accepting a stranger's kindness. Finally, she took it with a small nod, wrapping it around her shoulders. The fabric was worn but clean, carrying the faint scent of cedar. He moved toward the small kitchen corner, slicing thick pieces of bread and setting them on a plate. It's not much, he muttered, but it'll put something in your stomach. He poured her a mug of coffee, dark and strong, before sitting across from her. She cupped the mug in both hands, letting the steam rise against her chilled skin before taking a small sip. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "Thank you." Daniel simply nodded. He'd never been a man of many words, but the quiet between them didn't feel awkward, just heavy with unspoken things. After a moment, she began to talk. Not in a rush, but in halting fragments, as though telling the story piece by piece made it easier to bear. Her name was Clara Weston. She'd come all the way from Missouri, answering an ad from a man in Clearwater looking for a wife. He'd written her letters for nearly a year, letters filled with talk of fresh air, good land, and the promise of a steady life together. He'd sent money for the train fare and told her he'd be waiting at the station. But when she arrived, there was no one. A shopkeeper told her the man had taken ill with fever 2 months prior and passed away shortly after. His small cabin on the edge of town now stood boarded up, the weeds growing tall around it. The shopkeeper had shrugged, no family nearby, no arrangements made. Clara's voice shook as she went on. She'd been left with no money, no friends, and no place to stay. The innkeeper in town told her the cheapest room would cost more than she had. Someone finally mentioned a rancher who lived about 6 miles out, a decent man, they'd said, keeps to himself, but fair. She glanced at him then, as if trying to see if that description fit. I thought, maybe, you'd let me rest here for the night. Just the night, she added quickly, tightening her grip on the mug. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Her face was pale, framed by damp hair that curled slightly as it dried. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that came from weeks of holding herself together. He didn't promise her anything beyond tonight. But as she pulled the quilt tighter and leaned slightly toward the fire, he couldn't help noticing the way the room felt different, warmer, yes, but also, less empty. The wind outside had become a restless beast, rattling the shutters and whining through the eaves. Inside, the fire cast a soft, golden glow across the room, throwing shadows that swayed along the log walls. Clara sat close to the hearth, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, her damp hair now curling loosely at her neck. Daniel busied himself at first, stacking wood by the firebox, pretending not to notice how her eyes wandered over the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the neat stack of books on the shelf, the rifle above the mantel. It struck him suddenly that she might be trying to decide what sort of man he was. He cleared his throat. Storm's gonna last a while. Might as well be comfortable. She gave a faint smile, but it faded quickly. The silence that followed wasn't strained, but it was heavy, two people measuring each other in the quiet. Daniel wasn't much for talk, but he felt the weight of her loneliness, the way it matched his own. He nodded toward the fire. So. Missouri, huh? That's a long way to come for someone you never met. Her eyes softened. It was a risk. But. I thought I was walking toward a life. Toward something better. She traced a finger along the rim of her coffee cup. Back home, there wasn't much left for me. My parents passed, and the farm went to my brother. He's got a family of his own now. I didn't belong there anymore. Daniel listened quietly. He wasn't sure what to say, but something in her voice made him ask, what was it like? Missouri? Her expression changed, warmer, wistful. Hilly. Green in the spring. You can smell the apple blossoms for miles. My father had a little library in the parlor. I used to sit by the window and read until my eyes hurt. She gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. And peach pie. My mother made the best you ever tasted. Her words painted pictures in his mind, soft hills, warm kitchens, laughter carried on the wind. In return, he found himself telling her about the ranch. How the cattle seemed to recognize his voice, how he could tell the season by the way the grass bent under the breeze, how the air smelled different after a long rain. You've been here all your life? She asked. Born here. My folks came west when they were young. Built this place with their own hands. After they passed, I took it over. Kept it going. Figured it was what I was meant to do. She studied him for a moment. And you never married? He shook his head, staring into the flames. Work always came first. Guess I got used to the quiet. Another gust of wind howled outside, but the sound seemed far away now. Clara's eyes lingered on him a little longer, as if trying to read what he wasn't saying. They spoke of small things after that, books they'd read, places they'd never seen but dreamed of. Between the words were stretches of silence, but they were no longer the silence of strangers. The fire's crackle filled the space between them, warm and steady. For the first time in years, Daniel realized he didn't mind the company. And for Clara, the warmth of the room was more than just the fire, it was the feeling, however fragile, of safety. Neither of them noticed how late it had gotten. The storm still raged outside, but in that little room, there was only the quiet companionship of two people who, without planning it, had begun to fill the empty spaces in each other's lives. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Daniel woke to the faint sound of dripping water from the eaves, the air fresh with that sharp, clean scent that only follows a hard rain. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the quiet. It was the kind of morning where the world felt washed clean. When he stepped into the main room, Clara was already up. She stood by the small table, carefully folding the quilt she had used the night before. Her bonnet rested on the chair beside her, and the small satchel sat at her feet. She'd smoothed her hair back, though the faint curls still framed her face. "You're up early," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. She looked up with a polite smile. "I didn't want to take more of your time than I already have. The storm's over. I should be on my way." Daniel frowned slightly. "On your way, where?" "Clearwater," she replied, as if the name alone could serve as a destination. "There might be work. The shopkeeper said the hotel sometimes needs help in the kitchen. Or the laundry. I'll find something." She spoke with a practiced steadiness, but Daniel saw the truth in the way her eyes flickered toward the door, the way her hands tightened around the strap of her satchel. She didn't have a plan, only the will to keep moving forward. "Town's a good 6 miles, he said. "Roads'll be muddy after last night. You'll be walking half the day." "I've walked farther," she said quietly, almost to herself. Daniel stood there, watching her tie the ribbon of her bonnet under her chin. Something inside him tightened, a feeling he hadn't expected. She had only been here for one night, yet the thought of her stepping out that door made the room seem colder, emptier. He could tell himself it was just concern for her safety. That letting her leave alone, with no money and no kin, wasn't right. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. "You could stay," he said suddenly. She froze, fingers still on the bonnet ribbon, and turned to him slowly. "Stay." He nodded. "There's work here, more than I can keep up with on my own. Room 2. It ain't fancy, but it's dry, warm. You'd earn your keep. You wouldn't owe me." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the cost of trust. "Why would you offer that? You don't even know me." Daniel leaned a hand against the back of a chair. "Maybe not. But I know enough. I know you've come farther than most would dare, and you're still standing. I know you've got no one out here. And I know what it's like to be alone." Her lips trembled slightly, and she looked away toward the window. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and endless, the grass still glistening with rain. It was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving, too big for someone to face without a place to return to. When she finally looked back at him, her voice was softer. "I wouldn't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," he said simply. The quiet between them felt different now, like the stillness just before a seed takes root. Clara's gaze held his for a long heartbeat, and then she untied her bonnet, setting it back on the chair. "All right," she said. "I'll stay. For now." Daniel felt something uncoil in his chest, though he kept his face steady. He gave a small nod, as if it were just another practical decision between two sensible people. But as she moved to help with the morning chores, the light caught in her hair, and he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. A week later, the prairie had slipped into the quiet rhythm of early spring. The storm that had brought Clara to his door was already a memory, but Daniel found he thought of that night often, how she'd stood there in the rain, how easily he could have said no, and how different the ranch would feel if he had. The days since had been steady, but somehow different from all the years before. Clara had taken to the work without complaint, feeding the hens at dawn, gathering eggs in the crook of her arm, sweeping the porch free of dust. She moved with a kind of quiet purpose, as if keeping busy was a way to hold the pieces of herself together. Daniel watched her from the barn one morning, leaning on the stall door as she scattered grain for the chickens. She wore one of his old work shirts over her dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. A stray curl of hair had escaped her braid and danced in the breeze. The sight caught him off guard, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but to him, it looked right. She noticed him watching and gave a small smile, a shy one that didn't linger long before she turned back to her task. Inside, meals became a shared thing. Daniel had been used to eating in silence, but Clara filled that space with small conversation. Asking about the weather, the cattle, what certain tools were used for. Sometimes she would talk about Missouri, painting pictures of green hills and orchard blossoms, and Daniel found himself wanting to share his own stories more freely. Evenings were spent by the fire, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the room. Clara would mend shirts or peel apples for pie, and Daniel would read a few pages from an old book or work quietly on some leather repairs. They didn't talk much at night, but the silence wasn't empty anymore, it was comfortable, like the space between two heartbeats. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and lavender, Daniel came in from the barn to find Clara setting a pie on the windowsill to cool. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room. "You didn't have to do that," he said, stepping inside. She shrugged lightly. "You've given me a roof, a place to work. Baking a pie seems like a small way to say thank you." Daniel moved closer, the warmth from the oven still lingering in the air. "You've done more than you think, Clara. This place, it doesn't feel the same as it used to." She met his eyes then, her expression softening. "And how's that?" He hesitated, unsure how much to give away. "Feels less empty." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then maybe we've both gained something." That night, after supper, they sat by the fire as the wind whispered against the walls. Clara worked quietly on the hem of one of his shirts, and Daniel pretended to read. In truth, his eyes kept straying to her, how her head tilted just slightly when she concentrated, how her hands moved with practiced grace. She looked up suddenly, catching his gaze. "I'm glad it rained that night," she said softly. Daniel felt the truth of it settle deep inside him. "So am I." There was no declaration, no sudden touch or promise. Just two people, sitting in the warm glow of the fire, knowing without saying it that what had begun as a single night of shelter had turned into something neither had expected, something worth keeping. And in the quiet of that moment, Daniel realized the storm hadn't just brought her to his door. It had given them both a reason to open it.